I am your organizer, Michelle Beacom, managing editor of CIM Magazine, and my co-organizer is Ryan Bergen, editor-in-chief of CIM Magazine. Just a little housekeeping to get before we get started. If you joined by computer, please make sure that you've selected the computer audio button. If you joined by phone, please make sure you've selected the phone button. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type them into the GoToWebinar control panel question box underneath the question mark. Your questions will be held until the end. And now I will turn it over to Ryan Bergen to introduce today's presenter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today, our presenter is Ryan Jansen. He manages the Saskatchewan Research Council's Energy and Process Solutions team. He received a Bachelor of Science in Engineering Physics and a Master's of Science from the University of Saskatchewan in Electrical Engineering with a focus on microgrid reliability. He is a professional engineer with permission to consult in the areas of energy systems and environmental monitoring. Ryan has experience in project management as well as technical expertise in small modular nuclear reactors, microgrids, renewable energy systems, energy storage, remote monitoring systems, and district heating systems. So before we turn it over to Ryan to get started, I just want to make a note about the questions that you may have about the project. Because this presentation is about a demonstration at an active remediation site, Ryan will be only answering questions related to the hybrid energy systems and performance, as well as anything related to energy, microgrids, and renewables or a similar thread, not so much about the remediation project. So please keep that in mind when you are entering your questions into the question box. Now, with that, over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. Can everybody hear me okay? Ryan, you can hear me?
Yes, good.
Always good to check. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you all for taking time out of your days. I appreciate it. I trust it will be fulfilling and informative. I'm looking forward to the conversation after. Thanks CIM as well for hosting this. That's appreciated. Yeah, my name is Ryan Jansen. I've been with SRC for about 17 years now. Most of that work has been in the area of energy systems. Started out working in hydrogen fuel vehicles and then transitioned quickly into microgrids. And so I'm excited to talk to you about one of our hybrid energy systems here this morning. I'll give you some background on that. And then we'll also talk about some other further ones that we've developed since this one. But I think before I maybe start off, there's a few things I'd like to do. First of all, just want to acknowledge that I am presenting from Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis, and I'd like to acknowledge that our project was on Treaty 8 territory in northern Saskatchewan, and so we do pay our respects to our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis ancestors of the land, and reaffirm our relationships with one another. We understand the importance of acknowledging the past and embracing the future where Indigenous people and their traditions are both valued and supported, and that was a core piece of this project as well. Together, of course, we do strive for an inclusive and equitable business environment where everyone is benefiting. A bit of SRC overview, just in case you don't know who we are. Saskatchewan Research Council is Canada's second largest research and technology organization. We are second behind the National Research Council, which is Canada's research council. So we have about just under 400 employees. We've been around for almost 80 years, and we support industry, government, and communities around the world. SRC was actually put into place to help the Saskatchewan economy. That is our core mission. However, we do that not only by working in the province, by working outside of the province. Anything that we do that brings value back to Saskatchewan or brings information or experience is a place that we can work in. And typically SRC is positioned a bit between, say, the core research, academia, and core technology developers, and the industry, government, and communities. So we see ourselves as a bridge between those two sides, where we develop, we demonstrate, we optimize. We have laboratories that facilitate that as well. And so that's kind of where SRC exists and why we exist. We support clients in development, demonstration, optimization, and commercialization of technologies. That's over quite a broad range of places. SRC doesn't cease to amaze me sometimes. We kind of get our fingers in a lot of stuff. We're in an interesting country, an interesting province, and so that gives us a lot of ability to operate in some of these areas. And so we're active in agriculture, energy, in environment and mining. And then we have a couple project-focused divisions as well that focus on nuclear and rare earth elements. So my group specifically is on the research and technology side in technical services, and we largely focus in that energy area, although we do spill out into some of the other parallel sides. SRC, our main headquarters is Saskatoon. We have offices in Regina and Uranium City, but we do work with about 1,400 clients across the world in 22 different countries. So each of those dots is not just a made up dot. They are dots where we are active and doing projects. So yeah, it's a good place to be. I enjoy being here, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about the project. The last thing I want to mention is SRC does have an Indigenous Action Plan as well. It's built to align with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action. That's called to Action 92. It highlights the Indigenous Action Plan. It highlights SRC's continued commitment to working with First Nations and Indigenous communities. And it's based on 4 primary principles. It's employment, leadership, Indigenous community relationships, and business development. And this document ultimately is a living document because it continues to be added to as we understand better how to work as a community and and with Indigenous folks. So with that, I will start into maybe the more formal piece that I'm a little bit more comfortable with. Today we're going to go. I'm going to go back to basic principles a little bit. I'm not going to assume that people all know what a microgrid is, so we'll talk a bit about a microgrid. We'll go through the background and objectives of this project. So I'll give kind of a bit of a history about the Gunnar mine site when it was first incorporated, and then what really brought this to fruition. We'll go through some of the design details then as we are looking at implementing a hybrid energy system. What things did we have to encompass? What did we put into our design as we built the system? So we built it from scratch here in Saskatoon. So there's a lot of thoughts that went into it. I know that an hour isn't enough to go through everything, but we'll try to touch on as much as we can. And then once it was installed, I have some operational data as well as some analysis that we did during its operation. And as all things are, nothing is static. And so once this was operational, there was opportunities to further its operation in different methodologies. And so we'll go through some of those, and then we'll end with some of the projects that have happened since then that have really built on this hybrid energy container solution. So what is a microgrid? It's actually, it's funny, it's not a super simple question. Sometimes we talk about like a charging block in a phone and say, well, this is kind of an isolated power system. You've got your vehicle that, charges things. And now, of course, we have electric vehicles that can run all sorts of stuff. And so what constitutes a microgrid? Where is it an individual, just a power system like a generator at your campsite versus a microgrid? And so typically microgrids consist of, you have to have electrical loads, of course, so you have heaters or communication equipment or whatever it might be. And typically there's multiple forms of generation. And so often that will be, say, in this picture, we've got solar in the front, we've got maybe a diesel generator in the back. We incorporate typically energy storage. As soon as you have multiple forms of generation, it's typically good to have a buffer of some sort. And so battery storage is again, typical of a microgrid. And once you have these multiple components, of course, you need a layer of controls over that to manage that. The other part of a microgrid is that microgrids can be connected to a utility and operate in parallel with them. But the core piece of a microgrid is it can be disconnected. So it could always be disconnected from the utility. It could be a standalone microgrid, or it could be a microgrid that can be connected to the utility. So they can operate both apart and connected to a utility, but they don't have to be connected to a utility. This is my AI image. I like to try to get an AI image in there every now and then. So that's one that will come up a couple times, but we'll go on to kind of the background of the project. So for those of you that don't know Saskatchewan overly well, even those who are in Saskatchewan, we don't get up to the north very often. As is typical of Canada, most of our population is in the south. And so on this map, I've shown Saskatoon kind of at the beginning of that long blue line. That blue line is basically where our all-weather road is. We have one all-weather road that goes up to the north to Stony Rapids. So that's right in the center at the top of the province. And so that is year-round. But Stony Rapids is basically the end of the line. We have an ice road that gets built past Stony Rapids to Fond du Lac and Uranium City. Uranium City is basically the same place as of the Gunnar mine site. It's about 20 kilometers from Uranium City, where that arrow is right now. And so it's a long ways north. It's a very remote place. It's a beautiful place. It has a interesting history behind it as well. But that's where our remediation site was. I can talk a little bit about the Gunnar mine site as it is. Here's a Google Maps image from a couple of years ago. You can see it's quite an expansive area. The Gunnar site, I've got some notes here, so I'm going to look at my notes a little bit, but it consisted of an open pit mine that was at least 100 meters deep. And then there's workings past that go down to about 600 meters. It was operated from 1955 to 1963. So it really was operating for less than 10 years. And in 1964, it closed very quickly. The story goes that the mine owner had flown in, met with the mine manager, and said, "We're closing the doors." And then he flew out. And so it was up then to close everything up as quickly as possible. And it was kind of interesting because it was so remote from Uranium City, it itself was a town site. Gunnar was a town site. So they had an apartment buildings there. They had a bank, I believe. They had a rink, a school. So they had all sorts of things on site so that all of this work could happen. And so it was a town site that really turned into a ghost town almost overnight. There was little or no remediation work that was done. So you see that circular pool looking area there. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but right in that area there, that was the open pit mine that went down about 100 meters. That mine is the opening is about 200 meters by 300 meters. And it goes about 100 meters down. And just below that is Lake Athabasca, which is one of the biggest lakes in Canada, top 10 anyway. It's a massive lake. And their method of remediating at the time was they blasted a path from Lake Athabasca into the open pit and flooded it all. Done. that was done in 1964. And the mine itself was still, as I mentioned, quite expansive. There was a uranium mill at site with a capacity of about 2,000 tons a day. There was 2 acid plants at site, uranium processing buildings, the community that I mentioned, and there was about 4.5 million tons of tailings that were produced, and you can see them on the top left hand of the picture, as well as about 2.2 to 2.7 million tons of waste rock that was around the site as well. And so that largely sat there for about 40 years until it was decided that the site needed to be remediated. And so it kind of just sat like that. So I had the privilege of going to site in 2010, I believe, was the first time I went. And really, it was actually part of another project. There was a camp that was put at site for managing this remediation or for facilitating the remediation. And so our group is focused on efficiency. And so they brought our group in to say, how can we make this site a bit more efficient? They're using electric heaters. They were using a lot of diesel at site. And so our group came in to look at, okay, well, what's the best way of heating this area? And we recommended that they transition from electric heat maybe to a fuel oil heater that would save some diesel, because all the power was diesel generated. There was no power line to this site. And so as we were looking at it, we recognized something else related to how the system operates. But basically it was an 80-person camp that consisted of a camp A and a camp B. At the time it was operating from May through September. So it was a wonderful summer vacation place. You could go and it was quite quiet. I'd fish in the evenings when I was there. It was wonderful. But it operated May through September, and there was typically 5 to 15 people on site as of that 2014 time when we actually came and started doing some monitoring here for the electrical side. It consumed about 460 liters of diesel per day. And remember, it's for the 5 to 15 people. So the population was quite low. Diesel consumption was quite high, and it was quite costly for that diesel. Diesel had to either be brought in on the ice road and stored, or it could be barged out from Uranium City. And so diesel at the time was $2.30 a liter. And remember, again, that was back in 2014. There's a few pictures of kind of what they had there. The bottom left-hand picture is a generator. So they had 500 kilowatt generators on site that came as part of this camp. And so they, of course, were sized to meet, camp at full functionality, but in reality, they weren't functioning at full capacity. And so what we did was we said, well, let's take a look at what the actual site load is here. We knew that those 500 kilowatt generators were vastly underutilized, and it causes issues, and we'll talk about those in a minute here. But the first thing we wanted to do when we came on site, when looking at an electricity standpoint, was to monitor the loads. So we installed about 4 different energy meters throughout the camp to monitor the main load, like the full load, as well as some of the sub loads throughout the camp. And this is what we found is through a typical day, you can see there's kind of a low load overnight. People are sleeping. There isn't a lot of load going on. Breakfast and things start going at about 6 a.m. So stoves are turned on. And so there's peaks of power there hitting 25. That kind of stays for the most part until the afternoon. There's a bit of a lull. And then in the evening for supper time. And then we're back to a base load going overnight. And so you can see our max loads were typically about, over the summer, about 42 kilowatts was our maximum. Our average load was about 16 kilowatts. And our base load, our minimum load, was about 8 kilowatts. And so remember, all of this was being provided for by a 500 kilowatt generator. The problem we get there is, many of you probably have seen this, but this is a diesel generator efficiency curve. And on the vertical axis is our efficiency from 0% up to about 35%. So at the time anyway, your peak efficiency on a diesel generator, I don't think it's changed much, is about 30%. You can see along the bottom axis our load as it goes from 0% load on the generator up to 100% load. So the generator is 100% utilized. And you can see where you'd like to be is on the top half of loading. So that generator should be 50% or more loaded. So for instance, the 500 kilowatt generator, we'd love to see a 250 kilowatt to 500 kilowatt load. And the reality is we're seeing 50 kilowatts and less. So we're below 10%. We're typically even below 5% of what that generator was rated at. And there's problems that are associated with that when a diesel generator is not adequately loaded. You get excessive fuel consumption because they're not made to operate at 5%. They're basically just idling. And when they do that with no load, they can glaze their cylinders. You can have wet stacking where fuel is being thrown out of the exhaust. And so there's issues with that. And so the camp staff were actually told, the camp operator, turn loads on. It's pretty counterintuitive to what we're told as kids growing up, your parents get after you for leaving lights on. And here the camp operator was told to go around and turn lights on, like keep heat on in buildings, because they knew the generator was not being loaded adequately. And so they were told to turn on loads. So that was an issue. And even when they did that, they were not getting to the loading that, of course, that generator needed to be at. So we went into doing some design modeling. And so there was two main ways that we were seeing that we could reduce fuel consumption at site. So we did some preliminary modeling. So this was back in whatever 2014, where I was focused more on Excel. So we were using Excel to do some rudimentary modeling, which indicated that we could probably save about 40 to 70% of our fuel savings. And by two predominant ways, we could right size the generator. And so that was a key piece here, is if we could right size that generator, rather than having a 500 kilowatt generator, we could see that we only needed about 60 kilowatts. We did check with the camp staff and the remediation effort and said, is this about where you're going to be? Like, is it going to grow? Over what time will it grow? And they said, well, 5 to 15, that's where we foresee this being for the next few years or many years. And so that's what we sized based on. And then past reducing the generator size, we still saw an opportunity to add energy storage. So if you remember, our typical load was about 15 kilowatts. On a 60 kilowatt generator, we're still only at 25% capacity. So we're not in the sweet spot of that generator. So by adding energy storage, I'll tell you a little bit about that battery, but we added a battery system, and you can see this this figure at the bottom shows the capacity of that generator when it operates. And so you can see we turn on in May, and whenever the generator operates, it's red blocks, which means on that legend, we're between 54 and 60 kilowatts of capacity on that generator. So we're basically fully loading that generator. And when that generator turns on, its goal is to provide power to the camp, and then any excess power that it might have, say the camp is only using 15 kilowatts, the other 45 kilowatts that generator could produce is used to recharge the battery storage. So once the battery gets fully topped up, we turn the generator off, and that's why you see all these black segments in that from May through to September, is during those times the generator turns off, so it's completely turned off, and the battery is able to sustain the site for typically about 8 hours. So the generator would run for about 4 hours, it would turn off, and it would operate on battery for about 8 hours. And the Homer software that we used to validate our model indicated about 66% fuel savings to be expected based on this mode of operation. So that was substantial for the site. And so we went ahead and started doing our design. So you saw how remote this area is. I actually have some pictures that will come up here soon showing the all-weather road and the barge ride, but it's a remote site, so we had to have a rugged system to be able to go up there. So we chose a 20-foot modular container. You can put all sorts of things in CCAN containers, and so that's what our goal here was, is to put it all in a CCAN container. We divided the container into two, so we had I'd call it a 3-season room. It was uninsulated, but it was for the generator. And then on the other side, we had a temperature controlled area for the battery system. And we didn't necessarily have to have it temperature controlled, but I'll explain a little bit more about that. The generator, I mentioned we chose a 60 kilowatt generator. As part of the modeling, we determined that a sweet spot on the battery storage would be almost 260 kilowatt hours of lead acid storage. We chose lead acid because it was cost effective, and it was mature, but also because, if you remember, the idea was the site would go dark in September and wouldn't get powered on again until May. And so during the depths of winter, we were not planning to operate the system. We weren't planning to operate the generators. We wanted this thing to freeze solid, but then come back to life in May. And so we use lead acid batteries because they can operate right down to low temperatures as long as they are charged. And so that's where we added that 1 kilowatt of solar onto the system itself, is because we wanted to make sure that there was a trickle charge effect throughout the winter time to make sure those batteries stayed topped up. We also added an off-grid inverter charger, or a bank of inverter chargers here, so we could provide power to the site, and they are the ones that actually facilitated starting the generator and recharging the batteries. And so that was our design. So then we were off to the races after that. I will mention, I guess, there's 1 kilowatt of solar. I'm sure people will think, well, why only 1 kilowatt? We had thought about expanding it to maybe 20, 30, or 40 kilowatts. That would have been beneficial for the site for sure. However, because of the timeline of the site, they said it might be 3 to 5 years. It didn't pay to actually transport everything up there, set up 40 kilowatts of solar, interconnect it, just to take it back down and bring it home again. So we chose just to do the 1 kilowatt of solar, and we chose to actually install that right on the container itself, and we put it in vertical. Again, if you remember, the most important piece that we had here is we wanted to keep those batteries topped up in the winter. So we mounted the panels vertically on the side of the container facing south to make sure that through the winter, they didn't have snow accumulation on them, so they could continue trickle charging that battery. So you can see top left image, we've got our 20-foot sea can, we've got a kilowatt of solar. Remember, this is olden days. Like, it's funny, for solar, 15 years ago was a long time. So those panels are only about 120 watts a piece. Nowadays, it's really hard to find a 120 watt panel. Panels are 500 or 600 watts. So those are relatively small panels. We've got, I think, 9 of them on there, 8, if I could count, 8. It looks like 8. But we had about a kilowatt of solar. We also had fuel connections just underneath the solar panels there, you can see. So we could easily take it to site, connect it right away, and be ready to run. We have louvers, so you can see those louvers in the side of the container there on the top right image. Those were intake louvers, so our generator would be inside that compartment. Air would be drawn in through the louvers and then exhausted through the radiator of the generator through some gravity louvers on the end of the container. And then you get a bit of a picture on that bottom right-hand corner that shows the inverters. We have the faces off the inverters. We were working and connecting them all up, but we did all the testing. Oh, and you can see copper there too. If you're looking closely underneath the inverters, we had a big copper bus under there. So that's big money nowadays. So that was and the batteries are just inside the doors on each side of the doors. And so that was our system as a whole. So we did all of the testing in our labs here in Saskatoon. We had a load bank that was used to be able to do that as well. And then when it was time to go, we brought a crane out and we lifted the system up, dropped it on a truck, and we started the long path up to Gunnar. And so we actually did a couple things that were kind of neat. We put on just a trail cam on the back, so it would snap pictures every 5 minutes or so we could see the long trek up. And then we also put a GPS tracker on it because we wanted to see where it was at any given time in real time. And so that top right-hand picture is the all-weather road. So it's a gravel road that reaches roughly about 600 kilometers or so through the north. And so I haven't driven it yet. I've driven it virtually through this trail cam, but that's on my bucket list, is to take that all-weather road north sometime. Once it got to Stony Rapids, I mentioned that's where the road runs out. So it was moved on to a barge. So they had quite a large barge to be able to trek back and forth across Lake Athabasca. And so you can see that in the bottom right-hand corner is this our container got set on there. It wasn't set lightly. there was some bumps and bruises. When you're at a remote place, it's push, pull, and drag. And so they managed to get this off the truck, but dented an electrical panel and our barred HVAC system, but didn't hurt the functionality of the system at all, thankfully. So they put it on the barge and it drove or rode or sailed. I don't know what you'd call it when there's an engine on it, but it boated to site. When we saw it on the GPS tracker, there was a few times where we said, well, what are they doing? It stayed in one place for a day or two. And it turned out we looked at the weather, and Lake Athabasca is about 400 kilometers end to end, I think. And there was a big wind. And so there was massive rollers on that lake. And so it had actually sheltered behind islands a few times. So it was interesting to see the trek to site. Once it got to site, I actually got to go up and install it. It was within an afternoon, we had it all connected and ready to go. And so then we started running it. And so this is some of the operational data that we saw. So this is reminiscent of the load data that we had taken earlier. You can see peaks are about 40 kilowatts. We did turn loads on in excess to try to load it up a little bit more. So we got up to 65 right at the beginning during our test. But predominantly you can see our loads were between 8 and 15, 20 kilowatts or so. And so that's the actual load at site. And typically a generator would have had to just follow that, right? If we just had a generator providing electrical load, there's times where it would be at 40 kilowatts where it would be relatively happy. A 60 kilowatt generator is okay with 40, but then it would drop to 10. And that's where the generator would have struggled if it was just a generator providing load. Once we put the system in, this is what the generator actually operated at. So the blue line is what our generator operation was at. And you can see we would come online, ramp up right away to 50 to 60 kilowatts, and we would operate at that point for about 3 or 4 hours. Towards the end of 4 hours, the charge would start dropping a bit because the batteries are almost topped up, so the charge rate isn't as high. But whenever it operated, it was typically that 50 to 60 kilowatts, and that is the sweet spot for the 60 kilowatt diesel generator. And so remember, it would supply the community load first, and then any excess that was available would go towards charging the battery up. Once the battery was fully charged, the generator would turn off automatically. So you can see it would turn off and it would be at 0. And during that time, all of the camp loads were provided for by the battery system. And so realistically, what happened is it would run for about 4 hours and then be off for about 8 hours at a time. And so it was really quite interesting because we thought initially that it would be good to operate it during the day when there was equipment around and activity going on, and then operate on battery through the night. And then the site could actually be quiet. What we found was when we operate, we didn't try to force it to operate during the day or the nighttime. We just let it operate the way that it wanted to operate. But what we found is during the daytime, when the generator went off, it was silent at site. And that's something they hadn't heard for a very long time because the generators were always droning in the background. And so you could actually hear birds. And there was a safety piece of that where you could actually hear wildlife around where you couldn't before. You could have conversations without yelling when you're right near the camp. And so it was a real beneficial piece that we saw, and there was some good value there besides the diesel savings and the reduced generator operation. So analysis after that first summer. So this was installed in 2015. So we had done the study in 2014. We built it through the winter and we transported it to site in 2015. So our fuel reduction actually hit 84.7%. So it was massive. Now remember, that is partly because we downsized the size of the generator. So that fully admit that piece is that we had a 500 kilowatt generator that was just idling. So we put in a much smaller generator, so it used less diesel. But even with that, our average site load would have been 11 kilowatts, which was less than 25% of the capacity of even the 60 kilowatt generator. And so we were able to further reduce fuel consumption by increasing the efficiency of the generator and incorporating that battery. So the average generator load through this time was about 75%. So again, we're above 50. We're in the relative sweet zone of the efficiency curve for a generator. We reduced the runtime of the generator by 68%. And so that was a massive savings there, is because usually your maintenance is associated with the runtime hours, regardless of whether it's idling or whether it's operating at, some amount of load. And so we were only operating 30% of the time compared to when the generator was operating for 24/7. So that was a good savings. The 4-month savings that we saw there was $107,000 of fuel savings. And so that doesn't count some of the other soft benefits as well, but that's straight up fuel savings. If it operates for a year, which I mentioned it would only operate 4 months every year, so 12 months of operation would bring about $320,000 of savings, which yields a simple payback of less than a year. So you can tell when we built this system, it was about $260,000 to put that thing together from scratch. And so that's what this system provided in its first year. And then nothing is static. I mentioned at the beginning. And so when we had asked, is it 5 to 15 for the foreseeable future? People at camp, they said, yeah, things change, and especially in remediation, you got to pivot and you got to go. And so in 2017, so this operated for the first 2 years, including and then into 2017. But in 2017, the camp activities increased quite a bit. And so that load for the site, they opened up both camps now. We're seeing 30, 40, 50 people. And so that load was consistently reaching that 60 kilowatt and above. And so at that point in time, we started seeing some brownouts. And so at that time, they had seen this coming and they had upgraded generators coming because the old 500s were past their useful life. And so they did downsize. I think there were about 200 kilowatt generators that they put in. So they downsized them from the 500 level, but they put in upgraded generators. But what they decided to do then was this hybrid was still operational and valuable. They decided to transition and we decided to make it an emergency backup. So rather than them carrying an extra generator as an emergency backup generator, we use this system as the emergency backup. So it operated like that for another year or two in that mode, and they would run it every now and then and make sure that it was all operational. But then again, nothing is static and things changed again. So not changed, but we identified another opportunity. So the point on the top right-hand corner of the ruler, 0, is Uranium City. And so as the crow flies, it's 25 kilometers to Gunnar. There is no road between Uranium City and Gunnar. And so that trip was made in the winter to check on the batteries with security. So security would make that trip usually once a week, I believe. And they would go and just make sure that the site was okay. There was nobody at site through the winter, so they just wanted to make sure everything was good. I actually got the benefit or the opportunity to go to site a couple of times to check on the battery system as well. There's a lot of infrastructure there on the battery, and we just wanted to make sure that it was charging up, that we weren't going to arrive in the spring and find a dead battery. It was always charged up when we got to site. Getting to site was not an easy thing though. So we would snowmobile to site, and typically we would take some of the internal lakes there on the right-hand side, so we wouldn't go straight onto Lake Athabasca. We'd take some of these interior lakes, and then eventually we had to do a bunch of trail riding. And I remember going through that trail, and it was minus 35 out. It was chilly, and there'd be open water. There'd be springs that were still coming up. And so you had to be careful with what you were doing. And so we always went with a guide who was making that trip regularly. But there was another aspect here where by the time that 2017 rolled around, there was more activity. Now they had extended camp until November and they would open in February. So it was still down for a few months in the winter. But to open the site in February, it's still deathly cold up there. It stays cold through March and into April. And so to open in February, there was a lot of risks. They had to get to site. That was subject to weather. There were very low daylight hours. When we went in January, it would have been, it wasn't light in Uranium City till about 10:30 or 11. So you'd take off then. It'd take about an hour and a half snowmobiling to site. We would check on the system, but you only had about an hour, and then you had to get back before nightfall. What they were doing then in February to open camp was they would make that trek, but they would bring a small generator in a sleigh because they had to get the big generators running when it was minus 40, minus 45 outside to be able to open up camp. And so they would transport a small generator in a sleigh, they get it to site, and they would hope that they could start this small generator. If they got it going, they'd plug in the block heaters and then they would just leave it. They'd go back into town, come back the next day and see if it was still on or not. There was times where those small generator would not run. It's been on the road in minus 40 for an hour or two, and there might be problems. And so there was risks associated with that. And so we identified that there was an opportunity to make this system a black start system. So we added satellite communications with it. The camp had satellite during the February through November, but we added its own satellite communication that would come on automatically once a day. So at 11 a.m. it would wake up and we could log into the system to check things then. And when it came time to open camp, we would log in a couple days early and we would keep the power on. So it's being supplied by the inverters and the battery system. We keep the power on so our communication line would stay on. And then we would start our diesel coolant heater. So we'd manually turn on the diesel coolant heater to start warming up our little 60 kilowatt generator. And once it was all warm, we'd start the 60 kilowatt generator, and we had the block heaters from the big generators attached to our system. So as soon as our generator was running, well, and it would run on our batteries too, it would start the block heaters on the big generators. And so they would have been warmed for a couple days before anybody got to site. We also had a camera on the system so we could look around and see what the real-time conditions were like. It was very common to see snowbanks of 5-6 feet around there. So it was a really beneficial piece of this system to have in place. I think I'm getting close to time. I'm sorry, I might be getting lost in here a little bit, but I'm enjoying the presentation and reliving it. So I hope you're okay with this. We went ahead for even further operation. We have a weather station at site. And that was an important weather station, especially at the beginning of the remediation effort, because there was asbestos around, there was contamination. And so if there was a fire or if there was anything like that, we needed to make sure that we had on-site data for the current real-time weather. And that presented a risk where the only way to collect that was with a laptop going to site. So if somebody was at site, they go, they download it manually. There's always a chance of user error. There's a guy in our group that says there's about a 16-inch source of error all the time, and it's the person standing in front of the screen is the source of error. And so there's always a chance of accidental deletion. There's also a chance that weather station, it had its own battery and solar panel. If it lost power, we wouldn't have data from that part of whenever it lost power. And so we actually put in a LoRa network back to our hybrid, because our hybrid was always powered and we could maintain internet connection when we needed it. And so we had a long range network put in LoRa, and we did that ourselves. And so it could connect a kilometer away, and it was meant just to be low bandwidth, low power, long range. So that LoRa connection was really kind of interesting to work with. And so we would download all the data back to our main data logger in our hybrid container, and then we could collect that remotely throughout the year. So the current status of that system, it was transported home in 2025. The remediation effort is right at the end here. And so they're starting to demob some stuff. So this is one of the things that they demobbed now. And so it made it back late last summer. After 10 years at site, we're currently looking at refurbishing and recommissioning. I'd like to do some load tests on the batteries. For right now, those solar panels just keep those batteries topped up all the time. So it's sitting in the compound here behind my office, and we're able to do some tests on it. And the learnings on it continue to influence how we do new designs. And I'm just going to mention a few of the things that we've kind of implemented since then. So this system was installed in 2015. We did another replica of this hybrid in 2016. So our leadership had said, you know, it's great we have this system up there, but nobody goes to Gunnar. Like hardly anybody can go to Gunnar. It's not an easily accessible site. So we built our own demonstration unit. We used it as a way to have clients through and to look and see what it is. It's almost an identical replica of the one at Gunnar, except that we only did half the battery storage in it. Otherwise, it's almost identical. And that was recently purchased by a client because it's in good operating condition. It hasn't really been used too much. We did use it for some emergency power here a few summers ago, but it's been a system that we generated, and this is very much a replica. In 2023, there was another opportunity for a hybrid energy system. So the military, Canadian military, had an ideas competition. You can look up, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but in it, they wanted these pop-up city, it was a pop-up city challenge where they wanted rapidly deployable systems. And so they were focused on energy, of course, but also water purification, wastewater management, and waste management solutions. And so there was hundreds of people that had, showed interest. What happened through the process of that competition was some groups were made, and one of the groups had reached out to us to ask if we could participate on the energy side of things. And so we made, again, it was another 20-foot containerized rugged system meant for high temperature and low temperature. So it was very much on that side of things where we had to be ruggedized and reliable. We didn't include a generator in this one. This was only meant to be storage and inverter. It was a demonstration at CFB Suffield. And so we participated in our group along with, there was 2 other groups that made it to the end. And so all of us demonstrated for 2 weeks on site. And the team that we were part of ended up winning that first place prize. And so that was quite a good experience, getting some good feedback from veterans and active military personnel to feed into the system. And really that's our goal too, is to make sure that we're reliable and rapidly deployable and ruggedized. Another one that we've done is Descharmes Lake. This is one that there's some videos now. This was in collaboration with SaskPower. So SaskPower has some videos on this that are now published. SRC does as well. And so feel free to go do a search on that. It's an interesting system. It's 234 kilowatts of solar, 180 kilowatt inverter bank, and 2 78 kilowatt diesel generators with about a 0.5 megawatt hour lithium iron phosphate batteries. So this is located an hour north of La Loche in Saskatchewan. It's, if you can picture it, it's on the west side of our province, about 200 kilometers south of Lake Athabasca. It's almost the end of the road on that side. And so the utility had a line going all the way to this community. The goal of this was to demonstrate the reliability of a microgrid so that they could decommission that line rather than they were looking forward to a future rebuild. So their goal is to be able to decommission that line. And so this was installed in March of 2025. We're coming up on 1 year of operation. So shortly we'll be starting doing some presentations on this. It's been a great project. We've learned a lot, and it's been proving itself out. And so, yeah, it's an exciting one that deserves its own hour some other time. And lastly, I'll just touch on, we're actively working with a First Nation out in Eastern Saskatchewan that is focused on off-grid development. And so they're doing an off-grid vertical farm and an off-grid residential subdivision. And so SRC is working with them and collaborating with them to develop their own solution to be able to support what they need. So that brings this largely to an end. Next steps, our group, we just love doing this. We continue looking for opportunities for microgrids and nanogrids. We're very focused on the efficiency side, so that's why we like microgrids, but we also get our hands dirty on district heating, combined heat and power systems. We do a lot in the oil and gas sector on efficiency as well, so emissions reduction and technologies that are associated with that. Remote and northern solutions, we're working in Canada as well as outside of Canada internationally, and looking for opportunities on where energy storage, because it's an interesting time. Energy storage prices, we are seeing some drops. We are in price. We're also seeing some new technology come on. So yeah, it's an exciting place to be right now, is looking at opportunities for energy storage. That was, the picture there is actually one of our first microgrids back in 2013. That was near Regina for Cowessess First Nation. And so that's a utility scale wind turbine, utility scale solar, and utility scale battery hiding at the base of the wind turbine there. It's a lithium ion battery. So with that, I'm going to end. Welcome you to, come see us where I'm presenting at Sustain Tech, and SRC is there in the next couple days in Saskatoon. We're at a bunch of other places, PTAC, Methane Leadership Summit, Mining Supply Chain Forum, One that SRC asked me to mention was May 5th to 8th. We have a slurry pipeline systems course. So if that perks your interest, there's information online for about that. But yeah, I'm happy to talk, but thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Ryan, for that presentation. Just a reminder to our attendees to type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and please just give them a proofread so we can be sure that I don't muddle them. And yeah, just a note that questions focused on the power plant and not on the remediation site. So Ryan, how would you begin to assess whether a hybrid energy system would be suitable for a potential site?
Yeah, great question. That's always a good one, is where do you start? You'd start by, I mean, we would, if it was us, we'd love to come in. We'd like to know how the site works. That's really what kicked this whole thing off, is we're there for a different reason, and we identified, hey, there's some opportunity here. So getting to meet your operators, your site folks, and understanding how the site works, but then we can't really do too much until we have electrical metering in place too. And so that's one thing that we came in, as we said, we'd like to meter these places, meter them for a certain amount of time with high resolution, and then we can start using that as the basis for a design and a business case. And sometimes it'll make sense and sometimes it won't, but those are the first steps you have to take, is just understanding how the site works and what loads are available, and then we can start doing some design and modeling after that.
Presumably it'd be possible to build a microgrid with renewable sources of energy only. Is that correct?
It is, depending on the site. You're right.
Okay.
So if you know, solar is great, wind is great, energy storage is needed. What we see even at Descharmes is a good example, is you still get into times in the winter, for us anyway, where you have snow on the panels, it's frigidly cold, there's no wind, and that can last a week or two. And so to be able to have enough battery storage to last that week or 2 weeks is it's very, very costly. And so rather than doing that, it's more cost effective to have a backup form of generation like diesel at site. And you can minimize the diesel usage, but it is still beneficial to have that as a backup power system. Typically, there are times where you don't need a backup, or maybe you're only operating in the summer, or you can be a little bit flexible with your loads. And then you're right, then you wouldn't need a fossil fuel backup. But typically it's a good idea.
Okay. And have you looked at all into thermal storage solutions for capture and use of generator waste heat?
Yes, we have. And so a project I didn't mention here was one that we did around 2012, where we had a kind of a heat exchanger we put on the muffler, basically, of the generator. So we did use that. It adds complication. So it's a good thing, and we can do it reliably. It is another component though. And so in some cases, it's very beneficial for us. What we actually found on Descharmes, so again, this is new stuff, brand new. We didn't need any heat in that container. We had super insulated that container, and there's enough heat coming off the batteries and the inverters. We didn't need a source of heat to heat that even down to -50 outside. So things like that were quite interesting. And so I often look at that and go, all this heat is leaving through the exhaust. Couldn't we use that? If you have a use for it, great. You might not. We also use thermal storage in Descharmes. We use thermal energy storage packs to help maintain temperature in that container. There wasn't a lot of them. It was just a token amount, but that's another thing, is we use phase change materials to be able to regulate the temperature inside that container. Good question though. Yeah.
Are there limitations such as temperature or latitude which prevent someone from being able to use one of these systems?
There can be, for sure. I know we've looked at some sites on Baffin Island where, you know, you just have a long, dark winter, and, you know, there are definitely limitations, but there's ways around them. And so typically it depends on the operation. If you can go dark through the winter, that's something that we can still manage. If you need to maintain operation through the winter, that's where your backup fossil fuel generation comes in handy. So there's always a match. So microgrids, they're flexible, right? And so ideally a person can push a lot to the renewables and the storage side, but you can add whatever you need to add to make a system reliable, and it can go right back to a diesel generator. We've looked at fuel cells, incorporating those, heat pumps, and so there's a lot of technology you can bring in. And so it's hard to find a place where at least some amount of this technology wouldn't be valuable. But it does depend. If you're operating fully in the winter and only in the winter in the dark, that's a tough place to be. That's for sure.
Okay. So I think that was our last question. Thank you, Michelle. So yeah, like we looks like we ran out of time. Thank you very much, Ryan. Appreciate that. Very
You're welcome. And if there's other questions, by all means, I'm sorry there wasn't maybe more time to ask some questions. I appreciate the ones that were there, but my email's there. Please feel free to reach out to me. Happy to take that offline too.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Ryan. We hope that you all enjoyed our webinar. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and ask that you please fill out the short survey that pops up on your screen at the close of the webinar. A link to the video recording of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow. For more
Sorry, looks like we lost Michelle. For more presentations like this one, you can visit the CIM calendar of events on cim.org. We look forward to seeing you at our next Solutions Exchange webinar.